And that's it. Okay. So we're going to have a really exciting talk today. Thanks, Con.
Thanks so much, everyone. So it is, of course, wonderful to be back at the Robotics Institute. It's grown just enormously since I was there. I was one of the first students out of the Robotics Institute. I think Matt Mason was on my reading committee and Raj Reddy. And at that point, we were in a lab down in the second basement of Hammerschlag, which even Hammerschlag is a lot better than it used to be then. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So I thought today, I'm not going to try to do one of those things where the professor comes and tells you all the things that he or she is doing and it's sort of rushed and you don't really get a good insight to anything in particular. I thought I would focus on a particular topic that has come in and out of my research over the years. In fact, when I was a PhD student here at Carnegie Mellon, I was working on hands and grasping. And in some sense, well, we actually still have a project on hands and grasping. There's a student, Hannah Stewart, she's working on underwater hands. But it's interesting that the work that we're doing, we worked on sticky bot and climbing robots and stuff. When you have a little robot climbing up a wall, it is essentially a hand that is grasping the wall. And I'm going to try to make that point in what I talk about today. So, and then we've used the same technology for things like little perching quadrotors and so on. All right, so we've been working for quite a few years on and off with a guy named Bob Full. If you want to see a great TED talk, look up Bob Full TED. And he's a very entertaining speaker. He's a biologist, runs the Cyber Center at Berkeley, loves working with roboticists and engineers. And Bob, of course, will tell you that what you do not absolutely want to do is copy nature. For many reasons. First of all, nature has many other things on its mind besides doing some robotic function. It has to eat and reproduce and all the rest. Not only that, but the solutions out of nature are, you should understand how they came about. There's a lot of reuse of things that work. Evolution is very much the principle of what's good enough. So if you get people who in research on hands want to start talking about how like 5 fingers is the optimal number of finger for grasping and so on. Okay, so why do we have 5 toes? And why, in fact, do most vertebrates, including geckos, have 5 toes? And that's the point, kind of. It's sort of evolutionary baggage, and if it isn't bad, it gets carried along. So it's not engineering. Nonetheless, there are important lessons we can learn from biology, and this has been very much a theme of our work in my lab at Stanford for the last 15 years, maybe 20 years or so. Taking very complicated systems and collapsing dimensions and treating them as if they were less complicated. Managing the interaction with the environment. Animals are really good at minimizing energy expenditure. A particular theme of our lab, which Young-Lei Park is now continuing at Carnegie Mellon, is to use soft, multifunctional materials. I'll say more about that in a moment. All right, so let's talk about this complexity thing. And of course, the more you learn about any biological system, the more you realize, oh my gosh, it's just horribly complicated. How on earth can we possibly do anything like that? So look here at this cockroach. I mean, 72 degrees of freedom. How many of you have a 72 degree of freedom robot? Maybe not so many of you. 230 muscles. Why on earth does it? Okay, so first of all, insect muscle is not the same as mammalian muscle. Insect muscle is more special purpose. It's actually kind of a theme of insect morphology, that where mammals will have fewer, more complex degrees of freedom, insects will have more simple ones. Still, 230, even if they're special purpose muscles, and we don't even know how many neurons. So there is this horrible complexity. But at the same time, we're learning more, and we find ways to simplify. So let me branch off now a little bit into talking about the gecko. We've been working for years with Bob Full and Keller Autumn. For my money, the #1 gecko expert in the world. He's at Lewis and Clark College in Oregon. And it's only been fairly recently that we've had the tools to understand these biological systems in intimate detail. And I think actually that's one of the main reasons why we see this sudden growth in bio-inspired robots. As we learn more about how organisms work at the whole animal level, at the organ level, at muscles, all the way down to cells, all the way down to the components of cells. It's of course giving us all kinds of new ideas about how we can build bio-inspired robots and structures and artificial muscles and so on that will reflect some of what we learn. So the gecko is a good example. We see that it has this wonderful hierarchy of structures from the centimeter scale down to cetal shafts, 100 micrometer, individual spatular elements, 200 nanometers. So several orders of magnitude length scale. Once again, horribly complicated. Oh my gosh, what can we do? We can't build anything quite like that. But what you'll see in the next few slides is that if you ask yourself, well, what is this very complicated structure? What's it actually doing for the gecko? Then we can start to pull out some principles that we say, aha, we think that this principle is one that could be really important for climbing. Let's focus on achieving that principle however we choose to do it. So that's the process that we go through. We're faced with some challenge, like how do you make robots that go up a wall, or how do you make little things that fly and land on a wall, or whatever. We look at animals that do it well. If you want to look at climbing, so what's out there that climbs really well? Well, squirrels, they're great. Various kinds of insects also climb very rapidly and agilely. Snails actually go up almost any wall, but they're not exactly agile. Okay, so cross off snails. Well, what about, and then geckos. Geckos, 1 meter per second in almost any direction on walls. They even run across ceilings. So clearly worth looking at. And you talk to biologists, you examine the biological literature, and then you make some hypotheses about what you think are the important principles that are at work. And it's those that we try to emulate in our robots. And we use rapid prototyping technology. I'll say a little bit about that. It's actually one that was developed here at Carnegie Mellon that we took to Stanford. It started with Fritz Prins at CMU, and then he and I worked on it at Stanford. It's a 3D printing process like others, and I'll say a little bit about it. And it's at this point that there's something in it for the biologists. Because if we do have an idea about what's important, it is much easier to test that on a robot than it is on an animal. I had at one point a PhD student who was spending 2 days a week over at Berkeley in Bob Full's lab, and the rest of the time in my lab. And so for 2 days a week, he'd go over to Bob Full's lab. He'd take one of these big tropical death's head cockroaches and put little tiny tungsten wires in it, get it wired up so you could get the muscles, see what they're doing, put it on its little cockroach treadmill. Cockroach is tired, doesn't feel like running that morning. And this is after you spent hours, wiring it up. And that's actually quite typical of animal experiments. Just a very small percentage of the data is going to be useful. The robots, if they work at all, they're more likely to give you data than that. And we never get it right the first time when we analyze and so on, not exactly right. And so we refine, and we refine our hypotheses about what's really important, and so that process repeats. And so that's how it works. As I mentioned, the counterpart to having tools like scanning electron microscopes and all kinds of new tools for studying cells and things even all the way down to the molecular level with biology, the counterpart to that is that we as engineers also have now much better tools. We've got terrific 3D printers, we've got NinjaFlex, we've got all kinds of good stuff. We have been using something called shape deposition manufacturing, especially for our little running and climbing robots. As I mentioned, it did come originally through Carnegie Mellon, in fact. It's a process of incrementally adding material and then removing material, shaping it, say with a 3 or 5 axis CNC mill. And then because you've let the stuff cure, you can embed discrete components, a microprocessor, a sensor, bearings, something that really isn't quite practical to 3D print. And then you deposit more material, and the cycle repeats. And we still do use it in my lab. We use it especially for parts that undergo many, many fatigue cycles, because you can 3D print, like robot fingers with joints, flexures built in using your clever NinjaFlex stuff. But they still have a little bit of digitization on the surface. And so when you undergo 1 million bending cycles, they fatigue and they break. We can make flexures where the parts that undergo large strain are just glass smooth. And they, like a little running robot, I mean, the legs, it doesn't take them very long to undergo 1,000,000 cycles. And so that fatigue behavior is still advantageous, and so we still do use it for some things. This is an old slide, and yet I keep it because I still like it. It still kind of illustrates the idea. How old is it? Well, it was made by Jorge Cham, who, if any of you know who he is, was the PhD comics guy. And is now pretty much out of academia. But anyway, when he was a student, he put this slide together, and I still like it. Basically, we take a 3D model of our part, we decompose it into layers of sacrificial support material, part material, embedded components, and the cycle just repeats. And so here's a robot leg, has inside it, you can't see, but it has a little piston. You can see a little bit of a leaf spring. It has a little MEMS pressure transducer. It has a couple valves, and they're all nicely encased in this tough urethane part, and so it's very robust. It doesn't have little screws and fasteners to come apart and so on. And so we still, as I said, do use this for a number of parts. SDM, multiple materials, also lets you emulate important elements of dynamic behavior. So here is an isolated cockroach leg in Bob Full's lab. That's one of the good things about insects, is that you can take off a leg, and if you keep it hydrated for a while, you can hook up those little wires I was mentioning the other moment, and you can look at it and actuate it and see its properties. Here is our shape deposition manufacturing approximation. So it doesn't look like the cockroach leg, probably just as well. Hard and soft materials. The pink is a soft material, the clear is hard, but it has a quite similar behavior. And yeah, by the way, sometimes people ask Bob Full, why do you do so much work on cockroaches? Wow, cockroaches are cool. They're very survivable, they're very tough, they can go over rough terrain without even slowing down. And even in Berkeley, nobody cares what you do to a cockroach, is the other answer. So, yeah. All right, so yeah, so it turns out that the cockroach legs have actually quite a bit of damping, quite a bit of hysteresis, and that turns out to be stabilizing. It helps them to run over a wide range of conditions. And so we intentionally chose a polymer that also had a fair bit of damping. And so that's the kind of thing we do when we try to build these little bio-inspired robots that have both passive and dynamic properties, approximating what we think is important from animals. Okay, so I'm going to show a little bit of video here because they do still, this video was done a few years ago. This is PBS Nova. So please don't record this part of video because the rights belong to PBS. It's David Pogue. There was their technology guy for the New York Times. And I'm just going to show a little bit of it because they still do a good job of explaining how the adhesion works. And then I can use that to branch off to the next thing. One of the things you learn when these guys come is that there are other people who make way better videos than you do, so you should use their video. Let me get the sound up.
I head over to Stanford in Palo Alto, California to visit Mark Cutkosky, who's building a climbing robot based on gecko principles.
Our motivation is that we want robots to go anywhere. So we've had robots that can run along the ground for some time. The unmet challenge was to get robots that could go on vertical surfaces, especially smooth ones.
Imagine a world where robots could climb anywhere. Everything from everyday tasks like window washing to specialized ones like emergency rescue or surveillance would change. The key gecko feature on this robot is the material used for the pads on its feet. They're made from silicone rubber. Tiny wedges on the upper surface of the pad use the same gecko principle of directional adhesion, adhering when dragged down because of the close contact, but the rest of the time not sticky.
This is one pad on a little suspension with a weight about 200 grams below. If you just touch it to the surface, it's not sticky at all, but if you let the weight hold it,
Oh man.
Sticks perfectly.
So the weight is pulling down. That's the directional thing you're talking about.
Exactly. And then to get it off, you actually have to remove the weight, and then it will lift right off.
So it's quite firm now. If I lift up, oh my gosh, it's like electricity was turned off.
That's directional.
And that's what the real gecko does.
And that's what the gecko does. And in fact, if you've ever seen a gecko going head first down a wall, you'll see that it's turned its rear feet backwards. And it has to, otherwise it wouldn't stick.
Time to see the gecko in action. The lab's most recent creation, StickyBot 3.
And this is a ground granite slab, like a kitchen countertop. So
Okay.
it's too smooth to use something like little hooks or spines. So we really have to rely on the adhesion.
Start the gecko. Pretty impressive. And especially when they show me a piece that supports 45 pounds. I start having my own ideas. If I had gloves made of this stuff, plus socks, could I not make myself a gecko costume that would let me climb walls?
You're not designed to be a gecko. You'll get tired, but you should stay.
They say gecko adhesives would be useful anywhere you need extra grippiness, you know, tires or surgical bandages or sports equipment. But come on, we all know the real reason to develop gecko adhesives, so you can do this.
So hold this picture in your mind, because we're going to come back to it.
Okay, I'm busted.
All right.
Nobody has gecko gloves this good. At least, no.
All right. So let's hold that thought, and we'll come back to that. All right, so after working with Bob Full, going through that cycle of, oh my God, nature's terribly complicated, how can we simplify, what are the important principles, how can we put some of those principles into our robot, what we started to realize, in the case of the gecko, there are really sort of three main things that are super important. The first is this hierarchy of compliant structures. We need to conform to surfaces. For van der Waals forces to be useful, you need to be within like nanometers, a few nanometers, so that molecular forces can provide the attraction that you need. So this ability to conform to surfaces at different levels is quite important. And so StickyBot had, well, why is it not playing? Is it playing on the screen? No. Great. New update of Keynote and everything sucks on the movies. Well, I give up. Anyways, you would have seen the fingers move. The second thing, which I think we didn't appreciate how important it was until we started really getting along a bit with StickyBot, was this idea of directional or controllable adhesion. And that's what I'm going to spend the next few slides really talking about. It was mentioned briefly in the video. The adhesives have these microscopic wedges. They're a crude approximation to the tapering hierarchical structure in the real gecko, but they have the same basic property that when you first make contact, it's just, thank you, it's just the tip of this little wedge that's making contact, so there's hardly any area, so it's not sticky. And it also, by the way, doesn't attract dirt very well. But then when you apply a shear force, they bend over, and it's nearly contiguous contact, and that's what gives you enough area for van der Waals forces to work. And then this idea is that, okay, the point of having directional adhesion is that it makes it controllable. And that means that you can then start to use that as part of a scheme of force control between the toes and limbs of your robot. So we're doing the same thing that you would do if you had a robot hand and you needed to control grasp forces, and you have friction, and by controlling the grasp force and knowing friction, I can tell whether I'm going to be able to, you know, pick up this bottle or not. We play the same game, except that our internal forces are in the plane of the wall, and instead of friction, we're using adhesion. But it's the fact that it's directional that allows us to say, by controlling shear forces, I can control my adhesive force. So let's look a little bit. So what the biologists already knew at the time that we had started, what they had recently discovered, was that geckos only stick. So if you have a gecko running over your hand, it just feels sort of soft and fuzzy. But if you pull, suddenly you get adhesion. So if you pull the gecko setae in the direction they're meant to be pulled, you get this quite noticeable adhesion. But in the other direction, in any other direction, actually, you get no adhesion. You just get compression. And eventually you get sliding and Coulomb friction. So now let's not be a biologist. Let's think about this like a roboticist, which you're all, we like to think about things like what's the constraint space, or could I plot this in a two-dimensional or three-dimensional force space and think about a region of acceptable behavior and where the constraints are, and then have a trajectory in forces that doesn't violate those constraints. That's like a robotic way to think. The biologists, it took us a while to sort of get them around to that. But when you do, it's very interesting because here's what's happening. So here on the normal axis, vertical axis, is the normal force. So positive normal force means that I'm pushing into the wall, positive normal force. Negative normal force is I'm pulling away from the wall. Shear force is on the horizontal axis. Positive shear force means I'm pulling downward. Negative shear force means I'm pushing upward. So what happens if I push into the wall and upward? No adhesion, and I see that my shear force is in direct proportion to my normal force. That should look familiar to you. It is, in fact, just like a Coulomb friction. Oops. There we go. So that part just looks like one side of a friction cone. My tangential force is in proportion to the normal force, and Coulomb friction applies. Now, the interesting stuff is what happens down here. Now, the normal force is negative, but again, it now is proportional to the applied tangential force, which means what? It means if I pull down harder in this direction, I have more adhesion to work with. That makes it controllable. That means that if I want more adhesion, I have to load this foot and pull harder. If I want less adhesion, I pull less hard. And if I don't apply any shear force at all, I go to the origin, I have no adhesion, and I pop right off. That means I can remove my foot to the wall without, it's not like tape, or like duct tape where you have to peel it off. And in fact, young Lei will remember this, early versions of StickyBot, that was the problem we had, was that you would try to pull its foot off and it would shake and then it would just fall. So what you want is to be able to have it lift the foot off by relaxing the shear force, and now the foot can just lift off very gently with no force at all. And this means that there's this kind of safe region in force space. Any force vector that's inside that region will be sustained by the contact. And as soon as the vector goes outside, I either slip or I come off. And you can expand this to 3D. So far, I've just been talking about normal in and out from the wall and shear up and down. There's also side-to-side lateral forces. Not surprisingly, they're symmetric. And so what you get is this bowl-shaped surface, again, normal, tangential, and now lateral in the third dimension. And any force vector inside that bowl will be sustained by the contact. And as soon as it goes outside, I either slip or I pop off. So that's very nice for control purposes. And it leads to some interesting results, which are maybe not totally intuitive. At least they weren't to us right away. In the early days of climbing with StickyBot, we sort of felt like, okay, look, simple free body diagram says your center of mass is out here away from the wall a little bit. So, which are the limbs that really keep me from falling backwards off the wall? Is it my front limbs or my rear limbs? Anybody who's done any rock climbing will also know the answer to this. It's just basic intuition. Is it your front limbs or your rear limbs that keep you from falling backwards? Front limbs, yeah, that's where we need the adhesion. We need the negative normal force up here. Actually, my feet have positive normal force, so I could just have a high friction material on my feet and I'd be fine. So, because the adhesives at that point weren't real good, our tendency was to kind of favor the front limbs. Sort of treat them gently, try to keep them from slipping, falling off. And that means that if you did, for example, an even balance in force between front and rear, so here's your little robot or your gecko on the wall. The front limb has a normal force into the wall. rear force, normal force, I'm sorry, front force has to pull in, the rear force pushes out, both of them lift. If you share the load equally, then in force space you're where the green and the blue dot are. Well, there's the empirical failure data. So which one of these guys has the smaller safety margin? It's clearly the front limb, right? That's the one that's very near to failing at adhesion. The rear limb, which has positive normal force, is up here, and it actually has a fairly large safety margin in any direction. So what you need to do actually is move to where you support most of your weight from your front limbs, meaning that you move the front limb from here to here, and the blue one from here to the center of this circle, and now they're both equally prone to failure. So that means that if you're climbing, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but you actually want to support most of your weight from your front arms, from your arms, not from your legs, which doesn't work very well for humans because we don't have the upper body strength. But it results in a testable hypothesis for geckos. Do geckos, in fact, support most of their weight from their front limbs or not? Well, let's go look at some gecko data. Here we are. What do we see? So fore aft, that's up and down the wall. And the front limbs are the two on the left. The rear limbs are the two on the right. Left hind, right hind. And we see that, in fact, slightly more than half of the gecko's weight is borne by the front limbs. And that makes sense. Because why? Because it gives us the adhesion, negative normal force on the front limbs. The rear limbs, of course, because the center of mass is a little bit away from the wall, they have a positive normal force. They can just use friction. And then the left and right is just a symmetric pattern pulling inward toward the body. So in fact, geckos exactly do that. And when, as I mentioned briefly in that video clip, when you look at geckos going down a wall, notice what they have to do to their rear feet. They have to turn them around backwards like a squirrel going down a tree. Otherwise, they would fall. And when they go sideways, you see once again that they rotate their feet like casters on a chair. You know, they try to maintain that adhesion. And so one of the things that we did going from StickyBot 1 to StickyBot 3 is we made rotational ankles so that we could rotate its feet. All right, so that's the basic thing. And you saw the PBS video, you saw StickyBot climbing, and so on. Most of the work since then has been about scaling the adhesion to other applications, other length scales, and so on. For example, so if you think about it, the largest gecko ever in prehistory was about they think it might have been around a kilogram. It's a fairly scary beast, a kilogram gecko. And no bigger. There are insects like spiders that also use van der Waals forces for adhesion, but you know, they weigh nothing. So what if I wanted to have like a really big robot that climbed walls, like 10 kilograms or 20 or 50 or, yeah. Could I scale the adhesion up? So there's a fundamental problem, and this is something that Elliot Hawks has been focusing on. He's just finishing up his PhD. And the first point is that, okay, so lots of people around the world have been making synthetic gecko-inspired adhesives. Here's just a snapshot of a bunch of them. Ron Fearing at Berkeley maintains a sort of bibliography. There's over 100 publications. And some of them are, you know, they all have their different strengths and weaknesses. Some of them are very directional. A few of them are like ours, where they have this controllable property. Others use carbon nanotubes or things. They're very strong. But all of them, when you look at the test data, it's always for little tiny samples, a few millimeters on a side, and carefully controlled benchtop tests. And here's our problem. If I want to make StickyBot like a lot bigger, well, let R be the ratio of the length of the foot, which corresponds to foot size versus body size. Well, as I grow my robot bigger, of course, as it gets longer, area goes as length squared, but mass is going as length cubed. I have a problem. I need my adhesive pressure actually to increase as I get bigger. Unfortunately, that's exactly what all the published data on adhesives does not do. They all report very much diminishing adhesion as you go to larger areas. It's just fundamentally hard to get really good adhesion over large areas. So, in fact, even the gecko doesn't do all that well. Here's this is from this recent paper that Elliot put together. This is published data for geckos, and you can see they have huge adhesion at the individual setal level, somewhat lower when you get to lamellar scale, even lower for an entire toe and a foot. Here we are, so we start out already quite a bit worse, quite a bit weaker with our directional adhesives. And if we're going to follow a similar trend, there's just no way we're going to get up to sort of human scale climbing. Even the gecko, by the time you get up to human scale, it doesn't work unless you want to have enormous sort of Bozo the Clown feet. So that's the problem. If you scale adhesion the way, even assuming constant adhesion, and you want to make StickyBot bigger, you wind up with something that's all feet. All right, well, what are some solutions? So a number of people have said, look, you know, the gecko system, it's hierarchical. What you really need is a sort of progressive hierarchy of springy elements for conforming to elements. That's been an idea that's been around a while. And yes, that does help with the conformation part, but it doesn't help entirely, because what will happen is that inevitably one of these springs on, let's say, having to go deeper into a crack here, it's going to have a slightly higher tension than its neighbors. As you load the whole thing up near the limit, this one's going to pop first. As soon as it does, it immediately loads that one and that one more. They're going to fail, and it just propagates. And the whole thing, it's like an avalanche. You just get this catastrophic failure that very rapidly propagates across the whole area. So we have to avoid that. We need something that's got like the character of an avalanche, but we cannot afford to have an avalanche failure. All right. Well, how to do that? There are solutions out there. One possibility would be to use a phase change material. So I know Young-Lei Park has been working with liquid metal for sensors. You can do that. We actually even did an experiment where you can have a liquid metal, put it under all your gecko adhesives, or above it rather, have it in the liquid state as you conform to a surface, and then let it chill and lock up. And now it's conformed to the surface, but it's stiff. So you don't get those local stress increases, and it does basically work. It's kind of heavy, though, at the scale we're working with, and you wind up spending a lot of energy heating and cooling and so on. But it's still an option. So that's basically that you have springs when it's in the liquid state, and then you lock them all up after they've conformed. There are other possibilities. One is to use what's called a differential, like the differential in your car that lets the wheels on one side go further than the wheels on the other side. You can also use them as torque dividers, and again, there are many solutions of that sort. And then the third, which is the one that actually we've had the most mileage out of lately, is to use an array of degressive springs. These are springs that go up and soften and plateau. And so I'll talk a little more about each of those. So here's the differential idea on the left. Again, it's an old idea. Yes, there's a differential in your car, but if you think about it, even the old whiffle tree where you had a team of oxen pulling a very heavy cart is set up such that even if one ox gets a little bit ahead or behind its neighbors, nonetheless, the division of force is fixed by the lengths of these arms, and you get to control essentially how the total force is divided amongst the different elements, independent of small variations in walking speed and so on. That's a mechanical differential, and yep, it works. The degressive springs, we're using a shape memory alloy spring, which has this nice plateau, and they go up almost linearly at the beginning, and then they plateau, and we can make that one work as well. So the differential idea, I was talking with Peter Whitney about hydraulics and how hydraulics make a good differential, and sure enough they do. So this was the first idea, and it did work. It's essentially like a waterbed, and the idea is that you've got this fluid-filled sac. The gecko adhesives are here. Each one is on a little tile around the size of a postage stamp. They have a weak spring that helps sort of keep them initially pushed against the surface when you bring it in. And then when you pull, the pull force is transferred to this tendon, which is right at the middle of the tile at the surface. So it pulls with very nearly a pure force with no bending moment. And it goes around a pulley, and it's attached to this pressure plate. Well, because every pressure plate has the same area, and because the fluid pressure is uniform everywhere in this sac, therefore we have exactly the same force on every tendon, despite variations in alignment, despite some variations of the surface. And so this works quite well, although it is sort of bulky and you keep worrying, like a waterbed, it always wants to spring leaks and so on. Furthermore, we were contacted by NASA about whether you could use gecko grippers for grasping space junk. So if any of you have seen the movie Gravity, you know that there's a problem with space junk. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to just go up and very gently grasp onto a solar panel, lock it, and then pull it in? So that was the idea. Well, fluid bags is just not going to work in space. So we have been working on a different solution, but as you can see, they work very well. It means that a single tile and a hand with multiple tiles have really essentially exactly the same pressure. So that's force over area in normal and shear without scaling problems. So yes, as I mentioned, we've been working with a project with NASA. Here's a NASA gripper. This is with Aaron Parness, a former student now at JPL. And the idea is to be able to go and grab solar panels and reel them in. Well, water-filled bags is not going to work. But you can use tendons, and we can use a different solution. So the way the gripper works is this. Once again, we have these tiles, sort of postage stamp size. The little bendy adhesives are down here on the bottom surface. The tendon loads them at an angle, mostly in shear, but a little bit of normal force, and then we pull. And so as we do that, they're loaded and they grab, and then we can use the whole thing to lift up solar panels. And you can scale this to larger arrays. So you can still use a mechanical differential, only now instead of using water bags, I'm going to use a very long string with many pulleys. Well, it's the same idea. We have the tiles, we have the tendons are attached over pulleys, we have a tensioning spring, and as you can see in the schematic view up here, if I assume that there isn't very much friction in the pulleys, then the tension is everywhere the same in this long tendon. Therefore, I have another kind of mechanical differential that gives me uniform force everywhere. The caveat was what I just said about friction in the pulleys. Actually, it does eventually add up. And we thought this was a very clever idea, but like many other clever ideas, somebody else thought of it first. And I don't know if any of you read Italian, but what it's saying is that Leonardo, who, by the way, did not consider the notable effect of friction in all the pulleys, argued that in this case, with one weight could be lifted with a force equivalent to 33 times that weight for a lifting apparatus. But Leonardo did not consider the friction on the pulleys, and it is an issue. So that led to this second design, very similar. Once again, we have our little tiles. We have a tendon. It goes up, but now we attach each of these tendons to one of those special softening springs. And, oops, let's see if I can get that. Is there a video there? No, I guess not. Anyways, and that one has worked as well. So here's what happens. If you just bring one of these grippers in on a surface, what will happen is that due to manufacturing imperfections, a little bit of non-flatness on the solar panel and so on, the springs will start out with slightly different loads and they'll load up differently. And so you can see what's happened. This is real data from a large array of tiles gripping a solar panel, and you can see that some of them are doing what we want. They're loading up to the maximum force, but some of them are just slackers. And if they start out slackers, they continue slackers all the rest of the way. We need to get all of them up to follow that line. All right, so which is better? And the answer is it kind of depends. Here's the pulley differential. It's, as you might expect, every tile follows exactly the same force all the way as you load it up. And so what happens, though, is that as you do get to lots of pulleys, friction does become an issue, and you start getting problems with that. But if you want a solution for a modest number of tiles, and if you would like them all to have exactly the same load at every force level, then this is actually a really good solution. The other solution with the degressive or softening springs, it's much lighter weight. It scales better. what happens is that the different springs, as you can see, they start out all different, but then as you approach the maximum load, which is after all where you really care about, that's where you really need the performance, look what happens. They've all come up and they've plateaued at this maximum level, and so where we really need it, we're getting very good load sharing. So, and there are other things, local failures and complexity and manufacturing and weight and so on. So the solution that we came up with, and this is a schematic of Elliott's setup. So now think back to that PBS video with David Pogue putting on the gecko gloves and pretending to climb a building. And so that's what everybody does. They say, wow, when can we get some gecko gloves? And the first answer is that I could give you gecko gloves and they wouldn't work because you're not a gecko. We just don't work that way. We have our strength in our feet. So what you want is you want to be able to push with your legs but have that force transferred up to your hands through stirrups, essentially. So he's pushing down here. That's how he's pushing himself. And then he's using his hands to place. They're about ping pong paddle size paddles on the wall. Each one has an array of 24 postage stamp size tiles. And then they have these nice nonlinear digressive springs. So he uses the hand to place it on the wall, but then he steps with his foot. So the process is like climbing an endless ladder, where you kind of like move the rungs with you as you go. And it may not be as cool as gecko gloves, but it actually works. And there are other provisions, a couple extra cables, because one of the problems is that as you take a step, what you really don't want to do is lose control and swing backwards off the wall. So you try to also, you want to be actually leaning a little bit into the wall so that you don't tend to sway or lurch from step to step. But that solution works quite reliably. And as you can see, what's happened is that although we started out well below the gecko in terms of microscopic adhesion, we are with a solution that grows with area almost without a drop in performance as we go to a tile and as we go to a big array of tiles. And so it's out here that we can actually win with respect to the gecko. In fact, the gecko's adhesive, using its solution and continuing its trend line, will really not work for human scale climbing. So here's Elliott. As you can see, it's not, we're not scampering. We're not going to catch any geckos this way. But, and he's of course being cautious, but there he is using the hands to place the adhesive tile, but then he's taking a step with his foot because after all that's how people are really built to climb. And he's going slowly again because what you don't want to do is sway or lose your balance and swing off the wall and have to be held by the safety line.
What's the difference between where he is and the two side panels?
The two side panels, so this is glass, and then because of and then these are just sheets of clear plastic that we rolled over the side because it just led to a totally distracting video with glare and so on. So he's actually climbing on a glass sheet that has been bolted to the side of a wall, and then what you would see on the left and the right would be just concrete. Yeah. Oh, and we got so many complaints about how come you guys can do all this gecko stuff and you don't know how to hold your camera the right direction and things like that. So since you've asked a question, this is actually an okay point to stop and take a couple before I introduce the last little topic. Other questions on scaling adhesive bigger?
What's the approximate maximum shear stress you can generate?
Around an atmosphere. And there are other synthetic adhesives using carbon nanotubes that are quite a bit higher. The problem is they don't have quite the same directional behavior, so we really cannot use them. Other questions?
About climbing on less smooth surfaces?
Well, if it's slightly less smooth, we're okay. If it's considerably less smooth, then the solution using microspines is way better. And that's what sold DARPA Z-Man an array and what was used for RISE robot. You have a big array of very tiny spines around 10 10 to 15 micrometer tip radius, and they find little asperities on the surface, and then each spine can only take a little bit of load, so you have many of them, and it's the same idea. You have to distributely, you have to share the load, not get a local stress concentration that causes the whole thing to sort of zipper itself off the wall. And there is, if you look on YouTube, unfortunately all the DARPA climbing Z-Man stuff is classified, so you and I can't see it, although we have talked to some of the Special Forces guys. What you can see, though, is that a TV company called Prototype This! Came by and wanted to do something, and so one of the students got together with them, and there's some video on YouTube of a woman, a climber, a rock climber, climbing a warehouse building in Oakland using a paddle of spines. But she also, it's the same deal, she's using stirrups, because again, you know, we're really not made to climb with just our arms. Yeah. Other questions before I move on? Yeah?
So what about over 90 degrees?
Over 90, I'm going to show you in a minute. What you have to do in that case, because as you saw, we need shear force. And if I'm on the ceiling, I don't have it. Gravity doesn't give me any shear force, right? If I'm on a wall, my weight gives me a shear force, and that gives me adhesion. If I'm on the ceiling, the gravity now is in the wrong direction. So what I need to do is to pull in with two pairs of opposed adhesives or opposed spines. By the way, the gecko does that too. When you see a gecko on the ceiling, and they do that, they are pulling in toward their center of mass in order to stick. So the tendon, well actually you saw it already. The NASA video with the solar panels with the two tendons coming together and pulling, that works just as well lifting something up or hanging from the ceiling. Yeah. All right. Well, we talked about scaling in space and size. What about scaling with dynamically? What about speed? It happens that the adhesives are pretty fast, but we're actually now running into situations where we need to think about the speed of adhesion. And so I love this video from Andrew Spence of a Colugo flying, and look what it does, by the way, as it comes in, the feet go forward. It absorbs its kinetic energy. It does a bit of a stall, actually. It pitches up to shed speed, puts the feet forward, absorbs that kinetic energy so it doesn't just bounce off the tree, which, by the way, is what happens if you're not careful, and grabs. So this really inspired us. Originally with a guy named Alexis Lucier-Debienne with fixed wing perching, and now more recently with little quadrotors using gecko adhesives. So the motivation of the work by Alexi is that, you know, in the aftermath of an earthquake or some other disaster, the ground is a very hazardous place to be. It's hard to find a good landing spot, and even if you do, you're probably going to get stepped on or run over or whatever. If there are any vertical walls still left standing, they're much safer. So wouldn't it be nice if you could have a system where a plane or a little quadrotor comes in, and part of the problem is that these little things don't carry that much energy on board. So how many of you have played with quadrotors? You said more than half. And how long do they run before you need to recharge the battery? There you go. Yeah, 20 if you're lucky. So you fly, and then you run out of power. And so what if you, though, could just fly and land, and then spin down, and then you could just stay there, chill out there for hours or even days doing surveillance or environmental monitoring or whatever it was you had in mind, and then in the end, or you could recharge your batteries maybe with solar and then take off and fly home. So it seemed like a very obvious idea to us. We actually had trouble selling it in the early days, but that was the motivation. So here's Alexi's plane. This is not a looping video. These are sequential landings, and you can see if you get it all right, it's really very reliable. Even with a little bit of breeze that once in a while stirs the leaves on the tree. This is using a time-of-flight laser rangefinder. The plane flies in at about 10 meters per second. When it's the right distance from the wall, it executes a pitch-up maneuver. Once it's pitched up, by the way, you have no more aero control. You are ballistic. And so we come into the wall at around 2 meters per second, and then the whole trick is to absorb all that kinetic energy and not bounce off and fall. So we need to absorb a lot of energy, and this is using the spines, again, on a very rough wall. So for whatever reason, there's a lot more interest in quadrotors these days. I still actually like the fixed plane stuff. And working in collaboration with people like Vijay Kumar at UPenn and Sean Humbert and Russ Tedrake, we found it convenient to try to decompose the problem into two parts. All this part is their problem. This little part here is our problem. So basically what we're trying to do is to say, look, we will do dynamic calculations and we'll make our little gripping mechanisms and our energy absorption, kinetic energy thing, so that we'll try to give you as wide a range of initial conditions as possible for contact with the wall, such that we can stabilize the quadrotor and grip it. Your job is to do the control that you guys are really good at, to get it within the mouth of this little sort of funnel so that we can be confident that we'll land and attach. And by the way, as soon as any part of your quadrotor makes contact with the wall, these contact forces are huge, and you actually have way more authority over how the quadrotor is going to behave dynamically than you do with the rotors at that point. Besides which, you pretty much need to turn off the rotors at this point so you don't chew them up. Besides which, also, if you leave the rotors on too long, you get ground effects which tend to bounce you off the wall. So at this point, the quadrotors, although they have a lot more control authority than the fixed wing plane here, they don't really have any more here. At this point, they've pitched up vertically. The rotors are going the wrong way. You have no control authority in the vertical direction. And so once again, at the final instant, it's basically ballistic. So phase 3 is where we are. So early testing, we did a lot of stuff. We don't have the full Vicon system like Vijay at UPenn with the rotors and all the clever things that they can do. So we had our quadrotor that we threw from a launcher at different speeds so that we knew we could just look at the effect of different velocities, pitch rate, different orientations, and so on, and try to understand under what circumstances can we reliably grip. And just do a lot of dynamic modeling, and that's what you're seeing here. The mechanism, well, we've gone through several kinds. This is one variant that works pretty well. It's the same two tiles as you saw in the work with NASA, the directional adhesives, the tendon that loads them with mostly shear, but enough of an angle that, as you can see, there's a little bit of normal force as well. And then that's attached to another one of these nonlinear springs to absorb that rebound force. Otherwise, you'll just bounce off the wall. And then we also have some outriggers that help. As you come in misaligned, it initially skips and scrapes and dissipates, by the way, a little bit of energy, which is a good thing. And at that point, we grab and we try to latch. And in a little more detail, there's one of the mechanisms. So it's two sets of springs. There's a primary spring and this kind of collapsing truss mechanism, which is absorbing most of the kinetic energy as you come in. But then inevitably, even though you've grabbed with the pads now, there will be some rebound. And so there's a secondary rebound spring. And this is showing what it actually looks like. It looks more elegant, I would say, in the rendering than it does in the prototype. So let me just talk a little bit about those two springs. Same idea as with Elliott, that it really helps to have nonlinear springs. So if you have two sets of pads pulling together, the range of forces that we can fairly safely withstand is this green region here, okay? And as soon as the force, once again, it's normal force on the vertical axis, tangential force on the horizontal axis, only now it can go in both directions. And here's our tendon, and we can pull off at these various angles, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? Notice that this sort of magic number here is around 2 newtons for these little tiles, around 2 newtons in the vertical direction. Remember that number. Okay, so 2 newtons. Obviously, if I have a preloaded spring or a nonlinear one, then before I hit that 2 Newton threshold, I can absorb, the area here is the amount of energy I've absorbed, and I can absorb a lot more. So a nonlinear spring for the main rebound helps a lot. By the way, that 2 Newton threshold in tests with the launcher corresponds to an equivalent drop height of around 20 millimeters. And once again, for the main spring, if I have now a nonlinear spring, I can actually withstand a much higher drop height without exceeding that maximum force, and I have much more area. So in both the rebound spring and the main spring, it helps a lot to have a very nonlinear spring for maximum energy absorption. We also put in highly damping foam, and we've tried all kinds of other things too. All right, so this video was not playing properly within Keynote, so let me pop out, get rid of David Pogue, and there's a new video from VJ's lab, and fit the screen. And after this runs, I'll talk about a couple of interesting things we learned from this. Oops.
In this work, the GRASP Lab at the University of Pennsylvania presents a collaborative project with Stanford University to give our quadrotors the ability to push on smooth vertical surfaces, such as windows. The gripper developed by Stanford is not sticky to the touch, does not rely on penetration-based grasping, and does not use hook and loop fasteners, such as Velcro. When set and triggered, the mechanism allows the gripper to be adhesive. To achieve a successful perch, it is important to regulate the position, orientation, angular weights, and velocity of the robot at impact. Our work ensures that the quadrotor impacts the perching surface within the landing envelope determined by the researchers at Stanford University. We leverage a nonlinear controller to allow the robot to have large deviations from the hover configuration. Further, we use algorithms developed in our lab to plan trajectories which are guaranteed to be dynamically feasible and provide us with feed-forward control inputs. Combining the gripper-equipped quadrotor with our control algorithms and our trajectory generation methods, the robot was able to perch reliably on surfaces at varying angles. In these experiments, we demonstrate that our approach is easily adapted to varying angles and can perch reliably even on surfaces.
Okay, so let me just say a couple words about that. One of the things that's sort of interesting is the quadrotors in VJ's lab, they're big. They're half a kilogram. And I would actually be terrified to have them flying in my lab. They really could hurt you if they ran into something. But there's an interesting thing that we discovered that goes on. Quadrotors, as they get larger, this is another one of these scaling arguments. So the rotors need to sort of be, the power of the rotors needs to be scaled with the mass, right? So you have control authority. That's good. But your moment of inertia scales as what? L to the fifth. Mass plus times L squared. So these large quadrotors actually do not have as good a control authority for angular motions as little ones do. The difficult thing with little ones is that they're just super fast. And what this last video I want to show you is going to show is that we're working, this is hot off the video camera, we've been working on trying to detect good or bad perching in time to recover. And the challenge with the little quadrotors is that means within 40 milliseconds. The big ones, though, have their own challenges. Because they respond slower to angular commands, when you do this pitch up, you're spending longer at a point where you really don't have very much control. And so we really had to work pretty hard to reliably absorb the kinetic energy. That's why you saw a lot of that extra yellow foam with extra damping and more adhesives and more kind of robust energy dissipation mechanisms. So that is sort of an interesting thing as you think about quadrotor scaling. So this last thing, this is brand new, and I don't think there's audio for it, but this is a crazy fly. We don't have a Vicon system at all, so we're just doing control within the lab, initially with throwing it, but then we'll see some free flying with some little maneuvers later. So there, once again, it's thrown. That's a typical failure. That's what happens all the time unless you do it just right. Or it may be latched, but then the adhesive just didn't get a good enough grip. So here we're landing on a white wall, which is a lot easier to film than trying to do on glass. And there's a success. And what we've been doing is using is to try to tell that we've got an incipient failure or that failure is occurring in time to do something about it and not just fall to the floor. Remember, whether you succeed or fail, in both cases you've turned off the rotors as you hit the wall, and so you have just maybe 10 to 40 milliseconds to discover you've got an error, spin the rotors back up. What you don't want to do is to fall several meters, before you recover. And this is using data from the IMU on board the Crazy Fly, plus also just a basic force sensor on the gripping pads. And so with that, I think I'm finishing up. And as I said, we're doing the process we did with StickyBot. We're looking for inspiration at colugos and flying geckos like this one here. They actually do that. They some of them in the jungle, they jump off trees, they glide, they steer with their tail. They pitch the tail up at the last moment so they don't slam their chin into the next tree as they land. And they do some great energy absorption. We're right now making hypotheses about what we think is really important. We're implementing it, we're analyzing, and of course we're refining because we're still in early days on this. Well, thank you very much, and I'll open it up to other questions.
Any questions?
Yeah, Chris.
On the Crazy Fly,
Yeah.
you can turn the rotors back on.
Yes?
You can also reverse the rotors and press yourself against
You
the
could
wall.
try that, yeah. We haven't done. I mean, the whole having rotors spinning right next to the wall is a little scary too. But yeah, but you could do that, and it might help. We come in at a good clip. We actually like to do that, even more so with the fixed wing plane, because then you're less. The last thing you want to do is to be hovering very close to a wall when there's any wind gusts or anything. So we come in a good clip, a couple meters per second in many cases. So we have plenty of kinetic energy to load the adhesives, far more than they need. So reversing the rotors would do what? Well, I guess if I discovered a failure, if I could tell what kind of failure it was, maybe. Like it was just I didn't get quite a good enough contact. Then I could maybe give myself a little extra push by reversing the rotors. And that might allow me to do that without having to come off and come back in again.
I was assuming it was an alignment issue.
There's both kinds, yeah. So sometimes if you come in and you're really not well enough aligned, we do have those outriggers, remember, and they scrape a little bit and help align you. And yeah, I think as we start to look at diagnosing different categories of failure, that might be an interesting strategy. Yeah.
So with the quadrotor, you have a prayer of pushing off and flying again.
Oh, that's easy, yeah.
With the fixed airplane, do you have a prayer of doing
Yes.
that? You do.
Yeah, we thought that would be easy too. It turned out not to be. So remember, that's with spines on outdoors. Yeah. So what we do is the spines, again, if you go upward at all, they will tend to unhook. Well, that's what we thought. But by the time you've designed the mechanism to be so grippy and so good at dissipating energy and so on, it's actually like, does anybody have a cat? If your cat starts to climb a screen door or something, you can't just pull it off, right? You have to really get her to retract her claws or lift her somehow, And we had to do the same thing. We wound up using a shape memory alloy actuator to retract the spines, let the plane start to fall backward a little bit, spin up the propeller, fly upside down a little bit, and then roll and fly. And there's an ICRA video from 2013, I think, of that. Yeah. The good news with the fixed wing thing is that the time constants are a lot longer. So we have plenty of time to release the spine, start flowing back, spin up the plane, and fly off. The Crazy Fly would be I don't know where by then. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's other ways to switch to adhesion, right? So it seems like it would be easier to detach from the wall by using some other way to switch adhesion.
You could, and people have done that. For our adhesive, the fastest and easiest way is just to relax the shear force. So when we have the opposed grippers that we pull in, toward each other to get it to stick, all I have to do is have a little tiny solenoid or latch of any kind that relaxes that force, and then it comes right off. Other groups have worked on electrostatically enhanced adhesives and magnetically latched adhesives. I guess my personal view is that we don't, what we have works fine, and that's not the limiting factor at this point. So why would I go with this more complicated construction, at least until I see another advantage? Yeah. Other questions? It's a good question, though. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, come on, one more.
Actually, I have a question.
Okay.
So in the soft gripper,
Yeah.
so what happens if there's any moisture on the surface?
It's not good. Van der Waals force is a lot less in the presence of polar water molecules. It's true for the gecko too, but they have a safety factor of 200, so you know they're kind of okay. They also are using a super hydrophobic material, which helps. And in fact, as they get in the presence of water, apparently some of the proteins start to fold differently and they become more hydrophilic, and there's some theory that may help too. If you want to work in the presence of water, well, electrostatic adhesion, if you can withstand the current, is an option. Or you could experiment with functionalizing the material to make it less affected by water. Yeah, question in the back.
So have you thought about solutions for adhering to non-flat surfaces, like curved surfaces?
Yeah, we actually have, there's a curved surface gripper. I won't take everybody's time now. What we do is we put the, but I have a video of it, we put the gecko adhesives on a very thin 25 micron polyamide film. It drapes and conforms to curved surfaces very well. This is actually for the ASME journal that you were the editor of the special issue. And it works really well. You can throw a soccer ball at it and it catches. You can pick up a 5-gallon water bottle. It works fine. So the breakthrough there was how to make these adhesives on a very thin film.
How did you apply a shear force?
Just pull on the film. The film is relatively inextensible and sheer compared to the softness of the adhesive. Yeah, if you come by at the end, I can show you a little video of it.
More questions? Okay.
All right, thanks.
We have a post-seminar reception, whatever we always have.